Welcome to the Jeffrey and Joyce Myers lecture series. Those of you who have been to this for many years know that my belief is that a real institution has events like this, has events where luminaries from the clinical side of our house or the research side of our house actually come to Ohio State and address faculty and graduate students with maybe a little science, maybe a little reminiscence, maybe a little tribute. I have a feeling you'll hear all of that today. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome William J. Joe Benjamin, OD PhD, who is Professor Emeritus from the University of Alabama at Birmingham School of Optometry. I feel like I've known Joe a very long time, and if you want to, you can read his CV. And he attributed, in the hour before this, when he was talking with Jeff, he attributed this to a little attention deficit disorder. I don't know, would that we all had that degree of attention deficit disorder and could lay claim to this list of accomplishments. So I'm not going to read you that list of accomplishments because it would cut into your lecture time if I did all of that. So everyone, you should read that for yourselves. But here's the story I want to tell you, because I usually try to introduce someone with something personal. If you read through those pieces, what you'll see is that Joe was a principal investigator for Joe Barr's and my collaborative longitudinal evaluation of keratoconus or CLEC study. And when we needed people to recruit the patients and collect all the data, we started looking around the country for clinical sites and colleagues that would be able to do that. And I remember that Joe first and his institution second were on our short list, but anybody who wanted to be one of those clinics had to demonstrate with no funding that they could recruit patients, that they could do the work, and we were paying them nothing. So Barbara Fink is going, oh, I remember that, and Heidi Wagner's going, oh, I remember that, because sooner or later everybody comes back to Ohio State. He was a CLEC investigator apparently. So I felt like Joe sort of made this leap of faith with Joe Barr and me to accomplish that, and was eventually a funded, very successful clinic. But here's what I learned during that time, and as we conducted the funded CLEC study for many, many years. I learned how you figure out what a person, what a colleague's really made of. How do you, apart from all this, how do you find out what somebody's really made of? And I decided it's how the people who work with them think of them. And so when we were doing CLEC, we used to make site visits, and I got to see how Joe's clinical research staff viewed him. And I thought, how would I describe it? And I think they viewed him with deep respect, deeper affection, utter confidence in him that he would always know the right thing to do or how to get the work done, and a high level of trust. So please join me in welcoming this year's Jeffrey and Joyce Myers lecturer, Dr. Joe Benjamin.
It was a good front. How wrong they were. So, wow, I just am so excited to be here back in Buckeyeville. And you'll notice that I have a little Buckeye leaf down on my slides. I thought you'd like that. I also have one of those on my car. And so down in Alabama, I don't quite know what that is. I think it's a marijuana leaf. And I was in to the bank one day after buying my car and sticking that sticker on it. And the guy at the bank was wanting to come out and look at the car, and he saw that sticker on it. And he said, he was looking at it, and I knew he didn't know what it was. I said, that's a Buckeye leaf, I'm from Ohio State. And he said, Joe, I'm glad you told me that, because I was beginning to wonder about you. And then just maybe a month ago, I was in to get the car serviced, and the service manager was from Ohio State. I didn't know that he was from Ohio State. He saw it, and he said, oh, you're from Ohio State, aren't you? I said, yes, I am. He said, well, I am too, that's how I know what that is. I said, nobody else around here knows what that is. He had a guy come out, he said, hey, Jake, come over here. Jake came over, he said, Jake, you know what that is? Jake said, no, I don't know what that is. He says, well, go ahead and guess. Guess what it is. Jake said, no, I don't know what that is. Come on, Jake. Go ahead and guess. Jake says, well, I wasn't going to say, but you're forcing me to, and it looks like weed to me. So that's what I deal with down in Alabama about Ohio State. You don't see it on the TV very much unless you're high in the rankings. You lose a game. I heard a lot about it on And then, but most of the time, if they say something about OSU, perks up my ears. I look at the TV and they're talking about Oklahoma State University. So that's, but you know, when you beat Alabama a few years ago, that was really cool. My son went to Auburn. He hates Alabama too. So we're all straight there. So I wanted to talk to you today about hyperpermeability, hyperosmolarity, and contact lens future oxyopia. And what I'm hoping is that this future oxyopia is appealing to you. I got a bunch of disclosures now. I'm not in academia anymore. I work for the Alabama Eye and Cataract Center, Michelson Laser Vision, on a part-time basis. I have my own business, Material Performance Assessments, which primarily I measure oxygen permeability in my own little lab that I have now. And so I've got a lot of potential disclosures to make because that's what I do these days. Yeah.
Did you push
Oh,
the button?
do I need to put this on? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. So there's bunches of them. Even the organizations I'm members of, they might have some little things that need to be disclosed. I don't know. So I've got a whole bunch of them on here. Now that we've done that, here's the state of Alabama. And you can see here a blue-tip hound, which is a type of hound that is bred over there in Alabama originally. You can see the tiger, the war eagle from Auburn. Even though I am an Ohio Stater, I do think that this is the most incredible spectacle in sports is when they release that eagle onto the field. Here's the Tannehill Iron Works, which was an iron producing facility during the Civil War that was wrecked by Union troops in 1865. They built it back up into a museum. It's only about 10 miles from where I live. This is over here, Old Fort Toulouse, which is down by Montgomery. And it was the easternmost point of the French, what the French considered Louisiana at one time. They were competing with the Spanish, which was originally they were in the DeSoto expedition right through Alabama. And here's Spanish moss, a bunch of it on some trees. It grows as a kind of a fungus. And it makes the trees look so old. They must have been there when the Spanish came over. And that's why it's called Spanish moss. Not quite that old. There's a bunch of things in Alabama you probably don't think of that are technologically related. All the auto companies are there. Mobile Bay, Fort Rucker, Center for Applied Optics, and Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville and Redstone, Arsenal. So that's what we are in Alabama. It's a little bit different picture than you may have had before. What's Oxyopia? Oxyopia is an unusual acuteness of sight. And what I'm hoping is when I talk about permeability day and hyperosmolarity and some stuff on myopia control, that when we get done, you'll have an unusual acuteness of sight about those various topics. So what's decay? Well, oxygen permeability, or decay, is an intrinsic property of a material. It's independent of thickness or shape. And it's basically the amount of oxygen that flows through a material unit volume through a unit area across a unit pressure difference. It's a way of characterizing how much oxygen can go through a material. Contact lenses, stromal implants, corneal laser lenses, intraocular lenses, all of which I've measured in the past, they do not have a decay. They are devices. The material in them has a decay or oxygen permeability, but they do not. The materials that compose them are the ones that have the decay. I've also measured some in situ polymerizing hydrogels, which is a material. So that material would have a DK, or an oxygen permeability. What's DK over T? That is oxygen transmissibility. So that material has a certain thickness, it then has a transmissibility. So contact lenses, stromal implants, unlazy inlays, intraocular lenses, they all have transmissibility. They don't have permeability. But the materials that compose these devices, while they have a permeability, they aren't transmissible. They don't have any transmissibility. Well, I was going to say something about, if you look down at the bottom here, this is a graph that shows oxygen transmissibility on the x-axis and equivalent oxygen percentage on the y-axis. Of course, you'll know that equivalent oxygen percentage is a percentage that was invented by Dr. Hill over here, and that it characterizes the amount of oxygen available to the cornea as when you're not or when you are wearing contact lenses. When you're wearing contact lenses, the oxygen will permeate through the contact lens, and the amount of oxygen at the cornea in terms of percent, up to 21%, is the equivalent oxygen percentage. And at one time, I measured the EOP, or equivalent oxygen percentage, of lenses of different transmissibilities, and this is the graph that we came up with. And I divided that up into different categories. The last one's hyperpermeability, hypertransmissibility here. Hypertransmissibility is up at the asymptotic end of the curve, when the amount of variation between one lens and another up in that thing doesn't really matter very much. That's why we call it hypertransmissibility. What are the units for DK and DK over T? Well, the recognized units for these parameters were derived from Dr. Irving Fatt, and you can see there that they're pretty complicated. 10 to the minus 11 centimeters squared per second, milliliters of oxygen per milliliter of material times millimeters of mercury. That's complicated. And then the DK over T unit is 10 to the minus 9, something similar, but you'll notice that instead of centimeters squared, it's centimeter in those units. These are sufficiently complicated that we just call them DK units. I personally like to call them fat DK units and fat DK over T units. Not because Dr. Irving Fatt was fat. He was actually a pretty skinny guy. He was much skinnier than I am. And so, so those are, I call them fat DK units in honor of Dr. Irving Fatt. But it's easier to talk in terms of DK units when you don't have to have this big long unit to have to memorize. So those units resulted in whole numbers understood by scientists and clinicians in the field. If you had a material DK of 50 DK units and it was 0.1 millimeter thick, that was 50 DK over T units. It's easy to divide that out. Because you've got a shift from minus 10 to the minus 11 to 10 to the minus 9 transmissibility units. If you have 100 DK units, 0.8 millimeters thick, it's 125 DK units. It's very easy to understand this, and the DK over T's turn out to be units that you can understand too. So clinicians like to deal with these units because it gave them whole numbers that they could understand. Now internationally, international units don't include millimeters of mercury. They like to use HPA. It's the closest thing to a millimeter of mercury. The only problem is that HPA is not equivalent to a millimeter of mercury, and the numbers don't work out right. So if you have a DK of, say, 100, if you use HPA instead of millimeters of mercury, the DK and DK over T units were 25% units. That was a problem. And when we standardized these at the International Standards Organization, everybody on the committee, even all those internationally, agreed that we should stick to millimeters of mercury because that's what everybody understood. And it went through the Secretariat, and the Secretary said, yes, you can stick to millimeters of mercury. All of the numbers in the document were millimeters of mercury derived. And it went to Geneva for them to publish it. So they had to put it in type, do it. And some bureaucrat over there just decided to change millimeter mercury to HPA. It screwed up our numbers forever. Fortunately, here now, probably 15 years later, we're revising that, and this time we're going to tell Geneva no changing the units. So if you ever see these units in HPA, that's going to be phased out here pretty quick, and you won't have to worry about it. There's another unit that is used, and that's their term bearer. It's after a fellow from way before FAT that developed some of these equations for permeability, not necessarily oxygen permeability, but permeability in general. And those units don't really work out. Like bearers per millimeter and bearers per centimeter, what you'll see is if a speaker gets up and is talking in terms of bearer, he or she will invariably have to talk about transmissibility, and they'll be talking about bearers per millimeter. But let's say you have 50, let's say 100, let's say 100 DK units, and it's 0.1 millimeters thick. How many DK over 2 T units do you have? 100 divided by 0.1 is 1,000, right? So you'd be really 1,000, but they won't be saying 1,000, they'll say 100. And so they have when you transfer DK and bearers over to transmissibility and bearers per millimeter, the units are off by a lot from what FAT had, which was easy for us to understand. And so people recognize that. We say, well, let's go to bearers per centimeter. That'll be better. Well, if you divide 100 bearers by 0.01 centimeters, you're going to get 10,000 bearers per centimeter, right? Is that right? Am I right there? So anyhow, the units don't work out. So in my view, we shouldn't be using bearers, although it is technically correct for permeability. It doesn't give us numbers that we as clinicians want to talk about and are easy to understand. And the speakers that are using this and using transmissibility in bearers per millimeter or bearers per centimeter, they really don't know what they're really saying in those terms. So it's better just not to use them. Well, what's in a DK? What I want to talk about now is how DK is measured and what are the foibles that are involved. And so you have to worry about the boundary layer, and you have to worry about edge effects, calibration. You have to do multiple readings, and you have to be consistent and regimented in how you do those multiple readings. So here is the apparatus that we use. And I want to talk about the pleurographic method. This is the method that was originally developed by IRPAD for contact lenses. And David Rader, who's the guy that actually built the apparatus. There are two other methods of measuring oxygen permeability. One is the coulometric method, and the other one is the gas-to-gas method. And I have actually all three of these methods, so I've actually used all three. And the best one to use right now for most things is the pleurographic method, which is why I'm talking about that today, not one of these other methods. The gas-to-gas method, I'm not going to talk about how it works and everything, but it is applicable to non-hydrogen, rigid materials. You can do DK and DK over T on that method as long as you have a rigid material. If you're dealing soft lenses, which is the major item that's out there today, it won't work. And the coulometric method was developed by SIVA, now Alcon. And it's a much better method than the gas-to-gas method, but it still has its problems. And I'm not going to talk about the coulometric method, but it's applicable to rigid lenses. And you might be able to do some soft lenses on it if you have uniform thickness soft lenses that are special made so you can measure the oxygen permeability and transmissibility on that machine. But you cannot measure DK and DK over T on a coulometric method currently with powered samples. Like if you want to measure what's actually on the market that you can buy, that you're actually putting on your patient's eyes, you can't do that with the coulometric method. They have to make you up special samples. Those special samples can be measured with the gas-to-gas method. If they're rigid, they can be measured with a pleurographic method, but the pleurographic method allows you to be able to measure the actual contact lenses that you buy, that you put on patients' eyes, where the coulometric method does not. And as far as I'm concerned, I want to measure what the patients are actually getting. So that's the pleurographic method. So there's an edge effect. And down here on the bottom right, down here, you see the pleurographic electrode down at the bottom and the contact lens thickness above it, through which oxygen is permeating to the electrode. And you can see that the oxygen is funneling in from the edges up here a little bit. Now formerly, when it was first developed, it was assumed the oxygen just went straight across that membrane above it. But the oxygen actually comes in a little bit from the side, and that had to be compensated for. And there are calculations that I won't go into on how to calculate the effect of the edge effect and correct for it in your measurements. Now the boundary layer is another thing. So you can see here a thickness of contact lens, and if oxygen was going through that contact lens, and that contact lens was in fluid, like it's saline, the oxygen molecules would begin to bunch up at the junction between the fluid and the lens itself. That is called a boundary layer. The layer of fluid that's right up against the lens is not moving very much, where the fluid that's out away from the lens is moving all over, and it's easy for oxygen to get through it. So when it comes to the lens surface, that fluid is not moving very much, and it's harder for the oxygen to get through into the lens. Likewise, on the other side of the lens, the fluid has a boundary layer right exiting the lens, and it's harder for the oxygen molecules to get through that boundary layer out into the rest of the fluid. And this adds another couple layers, depending on how you do this, 1 or 2 layers, of additional resistance to the flow of oxygen through a contact lens. When you're doing any technique, and it doesn't matter what it is, if you have fluid in contact with the lens, there's going to be a boundary layer. So the coulometric method, to the extent that you use it with contact lenses, if you have a fluid layer above the lens, it will also have a boundary layer. The reason I say that is when it was originally invented, the inventor said it was not subject to the boundary layer, but in fact it was. So what we do, the boundary layer is the same regardless of the thickness of the lens. So what we've got over here on the right, and this was discovered by a guy named Miguel Rafojo, who actually passed away last year. But what he found was empirically, if you measured dk over t, which is what the machine measures, a precursor to a dk over t, you calculate dk over t from the measurements you get. You don't measure permeability directly, you have to measure dk over t first. Now, the way your effect was you had dk divided by t, measured by the instrument, you multiplied by t, and you got dk. But there are these aberrations like the edge effect that now you have to calculate for. And the edge effect is impacted by thickness. So you have to know the thickness in order to calculate out the edge effect. Also here, if you plot the thickness of the lens on the x-axis to the resistance, which is the inverse of the T over D, it's the inverse of dk over T. It's called oxygen resistance. It's T over dk. You'll get a straight line, and that's what Miguel Rafojo found. He was the first to find it. Now the slope of this line here for material A is high, and the slope of this line for material double M is low. But we're talking about T over dk here, so the slope of this line, if you look at it, is 1 over dk. and you invert that, you get decay. So a large slope here, like this one, A, that is actually a low decay. And this small slope here is actually a large decay. So that's how you correct for the boundary layer effect, because the boundary layer effect produces a difference in the decay you would calculate by merely multiplying dk over t by t. Let me show you what happens if you don't correct for boundary layer effect. So here is an example of a material that has a decay of about 120. And if you calculate, and if you plot T over dk, which is oxygen resistance that comes off the machine, here corrected for edge effect because we're looking at boundary layer effect, and thickness on the x-axis, you'll get a straight line as Rafoho predicted. And so the dk is 120.2. But if you then just take the dk over t that you get off the instrument, multiply it by t, and plot dk permeability versus thickness, this is the plot you get. Now remember, decay is an intrinsic property of the material. And so if you look at this, you'll find out that decay changes depending upon the thickness of the material. Look how much it changes. The actual values that I have are in yellow here, but these blue ones I put in as I calculated what they would be from the data. But you can just see that here on this, the yellow versions, over here we got a thickness of 0.735 millimeters, this point here. And we've got a thickness of 3.9, this point up here. And look at the difference in decay you would calculate between those two thicknesses. Here, the decay is about, what, 22, 23? And up here, the decay is what, 64, 65, something like that? That is the difference of decay you would calculate if you don't correct for the boundary layer effect. It's a huge effect. I mean, at one time I thought it was like a 15% effect, but it is huge. And as you get thicker, if you could measure these things up here in this thickness, the decay becomes closer to 120. The thicker it is, the closer you get to 120. But in the contact lens realm, we don't have anything this thick. Our contact lenses are thinner. And so there's a drastic difference between thicknesses if you try to calculate decay directly from dk over t out of the instrument. That's why you have to correct for the boundary layer effect. Another thing you need to do is calibrate. All these machines, they have machine drift and they act differently. They have different operators and they give different values. And so I developed a method of calibration. And actually, before he passed away, Irfat measured these on his instruments. And so we standardized on his measurements. I had 15 different sites measured. These are measured with coulometric, been measured with gas to gas, and the large preponderance polarographic. But I'm just going to show you some things here. Here is the plot, measured decay versus the reference decay that we established. And you can see that one site had a measurement system that gave them a large slope, and another site gave them a small slope. So there's big differences between the decay values that are generated by different sites with different instruments, even the same sort of instrument. And the calibration method allowed everybody to, if they want to calibrate to the same value. So that's what we do at our place now, is that we calibrate using these reference materials. Now, there are 4 materials you can see right here that I've actually measured since I established my new lab that I had already measured once in the old lab. And you see material 1, 84.4 dk, and I got this time recently 84.9. This one was 30.3, I got 29.0. This one actually I hit the same. And this last one, 103.6, I got recently one 6.8, which is an insignificant difference. This is after calibration. So even after all these years, if I measured the same materials, actually we don't know if they're the same materials. They're said to be the same materials. They're a different lot. They're a different lot number now than what I measured many years ago. But they still came out really close to what I measured years ago, at least for these 4 materials. And so here's an example up here of calibration. We've got a reference decay value, measured decay, and the yellow points are the reference curves, the reference points, the reference materials that I have. And these colored points here, the black ones and the blue ones, they're different. Lotrafilcon, which is Focus 90-day, Balafilcon, which is pure vision. And nowadays, I don't do all of these references. I just do 2 or 3 references here, like this one here. And you know, when I do the calibrations, I get a really good graph that compares the log decay versus water content. You can see a nice straight line there. So this kind of verifies that the technique is working real well. But over here, having got the same value recently for 4, or virtually the same value for 4 materials compared to what I got with my old system, it kind of shows that the reference materials are actually working against calibrations very well. And now I've got, as a graduate student, it's Tara Dupree, which there she is right there. And she's actually measuring a whole bunch of silicone hydrogels at the time, some of which I've measured before, and we're going to be able to add to this graph. I hope you get the same thing that I got. Yeah, I hope. You know. She said, yeah, I will. No, you get what you get. So there's some questions that I've answered in this area. One of the ways you can get different thicknesses of materials is to do powered samples like I was talking about, and you have to get the mean harmonic central thickness of those lens samples in order to get thin lenses and thick ones, a range of them, so that you can establish your linear relationship and get the slope, which would convert to get decay. And the question would be, well, on powered samples, do you get the same decay with powered samples that you get with uniform thickness samples? That would be important to know. Nobody's ever done it, except for we've done it. I haven't published it, but yeah, we did it with rigid lenses and we did it with soft silicone hydrogels. And what we found was when we made uniform thickness samples and powered samples of the same materials, we got virtually the same decay value for all the materials. So use of powered lenses to generate the different thicknesses for the pleurographic method actually works to give you the same decay value as you would get with a uniform thickness sample. Interestingly, the colorimetric method cannot do that. Don't know why. Does stacking produce the same decay values? Now, so some companies and some people want to shortchange the process, and instead of getting different thicknesses of the same material from thin to thick, what they'll do is get some lenses and they'll stack them to get the different thicknesses. They'll put 2 lenses together, 3 lenses together, 4 lenses, 5 lenses together, and they'll get their thicknesses that way. But what happens on that is that every time you sandwich a lens together, you introduce another boundary layer in between them. And so the more lenses you stack, the more boundary layers you put on there. And so we've looked at that to see if you can get the same decay value. And the answer is that you don't get the same decay value. And when I did it, I sandwiched the samples together, and I got about 12% less of decay value than with non-stacking. Now, other people have not published this, but there are those that perhaps didn't sandwich them together as tightly, and they got up to a 40% difference. So stacking doesn't work. Now, there are some decay values out there that were done by stacking. They're probably less than what they really should be. One of them I know about is the Oasis lens. So the Oasis is supposed to be a decay of 103, I do believe. But it's really like 147, because the 103 was done by stacking. Don't know why they did it that way, but possibly I I know that they actually advocate stacking, but it gives them a low value. Another thing you have to do on rigid lenses and non-hydrogels, you have to put an aqueous bridge behind the lens in order to transmit oxygen to the electrode. With soft lenses, you don't have to do it because the water is right there in the soft lens, and the oxygen transmits over the lens electrode really good. But with rigid lenses or non-hydrogel lenses, you have to put a filter paper band with a saline in between the electrode and the rigid lens in order for oxygen to make its way to the electrode. So the question is, does that have an effect? Since you do that for every lens, it's kind of like a boundary layer because the filter paper disc is the same for every thickness, just like a boundary layer is the same for every thickness. So if you correct for the boundary layer effect, the effect of the aqueous bridge should come out in the wash too. And so we looked at, we couldn't do this with rigid lenses because the only way you can measure a rigid lens is with the filter paper or aqueous bridge in there. So I took some silicone hydrogel lenses and measured them with and without the filter paper disc. And we got the same answer. So the answer is it does produce the same decay values whether you use the aqueous bridge or not, which means that our measurement of decay and decay over T through rigid lenses and non-hydrogels with the filter paper disc is valid. So if I might summarize the decay, it's not as simple as it seems. It's not a simple measurement of decay over T multiplied by T gets you decay. You have to correct for the boundary layer and edge effects. When you see a decay, you should ascertain whether they're corrected for. It should be calibrated because different sites get different values, and they can minimize the different values if they calibrate. Many of the ones I see in the literature are not calibrated. They have an easy way of getting those calibration samples from me, and I give them to them. But there are people that still don't use them. You have to make multiple measurements on each of multiple thicknesses of the same material in order to get a valid decay. Some people aren't doing that. You should have a regimented procedure. You need to stagger your presentation of thicknesses and materials and references. That is to correct for machine drift and alterations of ambient conditions that may affect your measurement. And you can't use stacking. If you use stacking, you get a lower value than you should. So we're in the age of hypertransmissibility and hyperpermeability, as I was talking about. And for usual soft contact lens corrections and normal variations of decay do not much matter. And normal variations of the T don't much matter if you have a material in the soft lens area that's greater than 100 fat decay units. For rigid lenses, it has to be a little bit higher than that because they're thicker. Now, we've gotten scleral contact lenses and Kerasoff-like soft lenses, which are very, very thick. Those are unusually thick lenses in comparison to what we had before. So those are so thick that this analogy doesn't apply yet. We don't yet have a material that is permeable enough to get hypertransmissibility for currently produced scleral lenses and also the Kerasoff-like soft lenses, which are very thick. So there is something that could be done with those, although the greater decay in the materials now has allowed those lenses to be successful. They're just too thick to be worn in extended wear. Okay, so when I was in Denmark, I happened to see a car that had the right insignia on it for decay, so I thought I'd show that to you. Did you know that soft lenses become hyperosmotic on I bet you didn't. So let me talk to you about what some people said in the past. Miguel Rafo, who I've also already talked about. I talked to him about 1990 when I first came out with this, a little bit of data in this area. And he told me because I think he liked my theory. He told me when I first examined the Wicterly limb hydrogel, this is about 1960, first was known. It was in Czechoslovakia. He got to see it somehow. I didn't think it would make a good contact lens because it would dehydrate too much on the eye. And he was telling me, boy, was I ever wrong. He said that's what he thought, and he was wrong. Jerry Lowther, who actually graduated from Ohio State, said the number one problem that wearers of soft lenses report is the occurrence of dry eye symptoms. And that's true. Most of them complain of that. And Donald Corp said later on, nearly all soft contact lens wearers who complain of dry eye only when wearing their lenses can achieve symptomatic relief if you raise the periocular humidity to 100%. So what he's saying is that the evaporation from the eye is eliminated when you're wearing those contact lenses. You can eliminate those dry eye symptoms. It's not really dry eye. It's dry eye symptoms that occur with soft lenses. Because these people, most of them, if you take the contact lens off, they don't have dry eye symptoms. So, you know, if they do have some dry eye symptoms, they're made worse by the soft contact lenses. So it's the soft contact lenses are not causing dry eye. They cause symptoms that are interpreted as dry eye. And Alan Thomason, when wearing a soft contact lens, evaporation from the anterior ocular surface occurs at a rate 1.5 times that occurring when not wearing the lens. So what he's saying is that the ocular surface through the lens is evaporating off much more quickly than if you didn't have the lens in place. So what does this do? Why is this happening? It's due to evaporation, but what does it do to the ocular surface? And my premise is that when the fluid evaporates off out of the contact lens, it is leaving behind its ions, and the soft contact lens becomes hyperosmotic. So how much would you think that it would become hyperosmotic? What's normal osmolarity of the tears? Anybody know? Somewhere around 300 to 320. It probably averages around 310. And so you probably think, well, maybe it might get up to 340 or 350, but it actually gets up much higher than that. And so we developed a method of trying to estimate the osmolarity of, or the tonicity of soft lenses with a West core osmometer. And what we have to do is, in a West core, there's a filter paper disc that you put in there and soak it with the fluid that you want to measure. And you shove it in a chamber and it measures the fluid. It measures the osmolarity or tonicity of the fluid. So what we did was, instead of a filter paper disc, we cut out the center of the contact lens that it had formed, put it in there, and shoved it in the chamber to see what the reading was. And so that was our makeshift method for trying to estimate the osmolarity or tonicity of the contact lens that just came off the end. Cut out the center of it, use it as a sort of filter paper disc in this instrument. And what we found was that the tonicity may start out at 290, which is a typical contact lens saline. It rapidly raises up and gets up to about 400 to 450 milliosmoles per kilogram. The normal, again, being 310, in about 20 minutes. So for all intents and purposes, it's really up there after a half hour. We only studied the first 2 hours in the very beginning. And we found out that the front surface is more hypertonic than the back surface by about 25 to 50 milliosmoles per kilogram. That would make sense, wouldn't it? It's drying off from the front, so the front's going to be hypertonic more than the back surface of the lens. And you establish this gradient of tonicity from the front surface of the lens all the way into the epithelium of the cornea. This is what is being felt by the soft contact lens wearers. This hypertonic, hypertonicity is what's being felt. And we did another study where we did this on 4 subjects. They weren't 8 hours rather than just 2. And we used 3 different contact lens care systems, and we used 2 different contact lens types. One was silicone hydrogel, one was not. And again, there was this rapid rise after 20 minutes, but after that there was a more gradual rise toward the end of the 8 hours. And there was significant effects of wearing time, lens type, care solution, and even interaction here between wear time and contact lens type. Here's the data over here. And what you see here is the mean tonicity for each one of these points, the wearing time out to 8 hours. And you can see that they raised up here. One raised up a lot more than the other. And over here you can see with different care solutions that this one care solution seemed to be higher than the other 2, which is probably why there was a significant effect of care solution. So you may all be aware of Gilbart's dry eye theory, where something happens to the ocular surface that makes the tear fluid more hypertonic. The hypertonicity then affects the surface and makes it more pathological, and therefore it's less able to stabilize the tears, and then the tears become even more hypertonic. It's a positive feedback loop that develops a hypertonic tear fluid. What these contact lenses are doing, soft contact lenses, is when you fit a patient with soft contact lenses, you are holding a hyperosmolar fluid in that membrane on the eye while they're wearing the lens. And this fluid is held against the cornea, the limbus, in soft lenses, the paralimbal area. The front of it contacts the palpebral conjunctiva, and even the lid wiper epithelium up at the top contacts the softness, this hyperosmolar area. And this produces a hyperosmotic stress on the tissues. There's a gradient from the front of the contact lens to the back into the cornea, and this is what creates discomfort because it disrupts these green nerve endings that are in the epithelium of the eye. And it's been shown, I learned this in Dr. Hill's course a long time ago, that the threshold, sensitivity threshold for eye drops is around 430 milliosmoles per kilogram. Now eye drops, they dissipate from your eye really fast. A contact lens at 430 milliosmoles is not going to dissipate, and it's going to create more irritation. So these are the symptoms. This hyperosmolarity is setting off the nerve endings, and it's creating symptoms that are interpreted as eye dryness. It may also be an indicator, so we're just talking about hyperosmolarity here, but it may be indicating that other concentrations of other substances in the tear fluid may also be elevated at the same time. They may be doing something too. So what are the potential clinical effects of this? Well, this may predispose the cornea to adverse inflammatory events. It probably plays a role in papillary hypertrophy because the front of the contact lens, the most hyperosmolar portion, is up against the palpebral conjunctiva. It may be a cause of corneal fluorescein staining because as the ions build up, they may disrupt the epithelium. And it may, at the limbus, interfere with some stem cell development. So the potential consequences of this, which are unknown, I'm speculating about here, could be significant. So I think this might be one of the hidden effects of soft contact lenses that is actually being ignored by the field. It explains a few things. Why does soft contact lens comfort get worse toward the end of the day? Well, what you've got is a soft contact lens on the eye that is stressing the tissue because it's very hyperosmolar. And as it's warm, the eye becomes more irritated during the day. Now it's known, and I did this with Dr. Hill many years ago, that the tear fluid osmolarity increases 1.3 milliosmoles per kilogram per hour on average during the day. But these contact lenses, the soft lenses, are increasing it far more. So there might be a tendency for people to have dry eye more toward the end of the day. But with contact lenses, it's much more of a tendency. And this is what drives the symptoms. People think it's dry eye, but it's really not. It's that soft contact lens sucking water out of the cornea and other tissues because it's hyperosmolar. There's some talk out there, and I heard Pappas from Australia, where they've actually measured comfort of soft lenses during the day. And they say, okay, what happens if we discontinue wear at out there about 8 hours? Take the lens off, rehydrate it, put it back on the eye, and wear it again. It should get more comfortable, right? But it doesn't. Because what their data shows is that the comfort level decreases to 8 hours. When they take the lens off, rehydrate it, stick it back on, for about a half hour it's more comfortable. But then after a half hour goes by, the discomfort goes back to the same level that it was before you took the lens off. So this hyperosmolarity explains that. You've irritated the eye by hyperosmolarity all day long. You take the lens off, you rehydrate, you stick it back on there, in a half hour it's going to be back to hyperosmolar again. No wonder the contact lens comfort doesn't get better after you rehydrate the lens. So what I believe is that the field should look to decrease the concentration of tear constituents and osmolarity that happen with the soft contact lens wear. I think they're missing the boat. All of these things they're doing about dry eye this, dry eye that, with soft contact lenses is missing the issue. And someday, we're going to look back on Miguel Rafo's original comment after we fix this problem with hyperosmolarity. We're going to look back at that, and he says, when I first examined the Wichterly and Lim hydrogel, I didn't think it would make a good contact lens because it would dehydrate too much on the eye. We're going to look back at that someday when we have better soft contact lenses or better other contact lenses. And we're going to say, you know what? He was right. Those contact lenses back then, they really weren't very good because they did dehydrate on the eye. Well, those first two topics were topics that I had data on. I see that I might be, well, I got until 6:30, don't I?
Yeah, you're gonna have to,
I'm gonna have to hustle through
these
this.
guys over here are more comfortable if you have to go.
Huh?
These guys will get more comfortable during this part over here to my left.
Is that right?
See how this goes.
Well, they may. So this one is something that I haven't done personal work in myself, but I have a few little comments I want to make. As an outsider, see, i.e. the outsider. And it's good to have an outside view of things every once in a while, don't you think? But this is really something else in this field. Let's talk about the Petzval surface. The Petzval surface is a theoretical surface due to curvature of field, where if you take an optical element such as this one, you can see that we have an image plane here that we would hope that this thing would image upon, but the image is actually curved. So if you take these rays of light through this lens and trace them, they will trace to be focused on the Petzval surface, not this flat image plane. This has been known for a long time. But the back of the eye is curved too. How lucky is that? The optical elements should produce, the positive optical elements of the eye should produce a Petzval surface that is curved. And we would be really lucky if we could match the Petzval surface to the retinal surface. This has been known a long time. We should maybe think about doing it. So that's an idea that they came up a long time ago. So where is the Petzval surface relative to the retina? This is of importance nowadays, and because of the myopia control contact lenses issue. So let's say we had peripheral hemetropia. That would mean that the peripheral part of the pet's fault surface would match the retina, like what you see here. If we had hyperopic defocus, it would look like this. It would be in focus centrally, but out of focus behind the retina peripherally. So this is the theoretical instigator of myopia. That Jeff Walling, where is he? Is he here? There it is. He knows all about this. Donald Muti, where is he? They're silent. They know all about it. I'm getting myself in trouble. And myopic defocus would be when the pet's fault surface was on the inside, and you can see how it goes there. That's supposed to be the savior of myopia. If you could do this, you might be able to limit myopia. If you could do it with a contact lens, that would be really great for the contact lens industry. So the idea is, let's create peripheral hemetropia or myopic defocus with contact lenses rather than hyperopic defocus. So how we do that? Well, there's two main methods. One is to take a near center type of lens, which has a distance power in the center and near power in the periphery. Put it on the eye and see if you can change the peripheral focus. The other way is corneal reshaping with rigid contact lenses, and that has a couple mechanisms of doing that. I'm not going to go into that, but once you put the lens on the eye and change the shape, you take it off, you've got a junction out here between the periphery and the central area where you have a steeper curvature and angular area. And even if you put this spherical surface on the eye was prolate to begin with, and you put that spherical surface on it and take it off, it's going to be more spherical. So both of those effects may add up to being something that's being looked at for decreasing or reducing the amount of myopia. But I have a sense of deja vu about this because I went through the wars of these type of contact lenses with presbyopia, where it was thought, well, all we got to do is create a lens that has a central focus and a peripheral focus. The central focus will focus on the macula, and the peripheral focus can be used for near, and the person can switch from distance to near and attend to one or the other. But that's not what is happening here. What they think is that the center of one of these progressive lens, distance center lenses, is going to exclusively focus at the fovea. And the periphery of that lens is going to exclusively focus in the periphery, and that's not how things work. The entire optic zone through which the pupil looks is responsible for not only the focus at the fovea, but the focus in the periphery. So it's not a situation where the center of this lens is responsible for the central focus at the fovea macula, because the periphery also contributes to that image. And in the periphery, it is not the case where the peripheral part of this lens focuses light in the periphery, because the center part of the lens also is responsible for some of the light that focuses in the periphery. That's just the way it works. The spherical aberration has been increased with these progressive lenses in order to try to get the effect that is not really being achieved. The entire optical aperture of the lens contributes to the foveal image, and the entire optical aperture of the lens contributes to the peripheral image. If you look at central vision, what you're going to have is light that's not really all focused at the fovea. So you're fitting a kid with a progressive lens to try to limit their myopia, but you're really diffusing the image of the central cornea. The central retina. What's that going to do, I ask, to the functional vision of a young person who wears this for 10 or 15 years to try to retard the development of myopia? That is my question looking from the outside. I don't think that's actually being addressed. Is it? It is now?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, good deal. It wasn't a couple years ago. So here's another one. Maybe this will rile you up. So have you ever heard of the coronial
You can sit
effect?
next to him at dinner.
So the coronial effect is if you shine a light in from 30 degrees behind your iris into the side of your eye, it'll go through the cornea and it'll highlight the nasal part right at the surface. And you can see that here. Here's my light. Here's my poor optometry student. And then here is a glow of light at the nasal part. And the light enters and comes over here and glows over here. If you bring the light forward, it shines into the angle. Forward more than that, it'll shine into the lens. So over your lifetime, this light comes in from the side, ultraviolet light, and it runs through and it starts focusing somewhere over nasally. Could be in the lens, could be in the lummus, could be in the angle. And this is credited with development of pigwecula. You know, most of them are nasal. And if you look at cataracts, they form worse nasally. They start forming nasally and they're always worse nasally and inferiorly because you got the sun coming in from above. So this is proof, almost proof, that peripheral light can come in and damage ocular tissue, even though you're not looking. So what about peripheral retinal atrophy, lattice degeneration of retinal thinning? One of the theories from this is that peripheral light comes in, gets into the eye, and hits the peripheral retina. So when you look at the sun, have you ever looked at the sun? Well, evidently not, or you'd have a burnout fovea, right? So you don't look at the sun, because you'd burn a hole in your fovea. Why is it then when you're not looking at the sun, the light doesn't burn a hole in your peripheral retina? It's because it's diffused. You got radial astigmatism. You got color aberration and curvature of field. All these aberrations that are diffusing the light into the periphery. And so the sun up there doesn't burn a hole in your peripheral retina. But what we're trying to do now is clear up that peripheral image with myopia control contact lenses. What are you going to do to the peripheral retina if you clear it up with myopia control contact lenses when you're not looking at the sun and it starts hitting your peripheral retina? That's all I'm asking. I don't have any proof one way or another. I'm just looking from the outside. What are you going to be doing in the peripheral? Are you going to be burning holes in the peripheral retina? Or are you increasing the light concentration there such that people end up with more lattice degeneration, more thinning out there, more retinal detachment? I don't know. I'm just asking the question because I'm looking from the outside. It's easy to throw bombshells from the outside. So that's what I'm doing. There are some people out there saying, everybody, all these kids, everybody, every kid, because they have a chance of getting myopia, which is a scourge. We need to have all of them wearing myopia control contact lenses. You've heard them. I've heard them. Haven't you heard them out there? And so let me see what happens. Microbial keratitis had 5 cases for every 10,000 contact lens wearers in daily wear. Here's how many, and if we fit 50% of all people 10 to 25 years old, these are the number of microbial keratitises that occur every year in the USA, in India, China, and Europe. That's quite a number. And what about acanthamoeba? At 1 to 33. Well, if you only have 1 to 33 per million, 1 per million, you get this number of acanthamoeba infection, but that is really serious. If you have 33 per million, you get this lower limit. So I would say probably somewhere in between this is where the real rate of acanthamoeba keratitis is. Let's say it's halfway in between. That is a lot of acanthamoeba keratitis to be fitting 50% of all kids with myopia control contact lenses. Now, I think I'm more on better footing with this. I think it's, so there are people out there that are pushing this concept of everybody wearing them. And I would just say, because the lenses do not focus like centrally merely at the center and the peripherally merely in the periphery, the theory of myopia control based on peripheral focus is not yet proven. They're saying that these lenses can do something, but they're really not doing it, so they're acting in some other fashion. The use of multifocal or progressively powered contact lenses may have unanticipated, unwanted consequences, like what might happen to a person who blurs their central fovea for a long period, or the periphery where light may come in and damage the peripheral retina. We don't know. And lastly, the risks of contact lens wear are significant even in daily wear. Now, I was using figures from the United States, not figures from other countries. They may be higher in other countries. I don't know what the rate would be with kids as opposed to adults, but there is a rate of microbial keratitis, acanthamoeba, that must be balanced against the potential benefit that accrues. So I believe that the indiscriminate wear of contact lenses for myopia control is problematic. Well, should I go on, or
You should finish, I think.
should I finish? So there are great hopes that myopia can be controlled by wearing contact lenses that stem from practitioners, academic, and other researchers in the contact lens industry. But I've been around long enough to know that things may not always be as you were told. Because I can remember when bifocal and multifocal contact lenses for presbyopia were told to us that those were so great. Clinicians would come out, the high volume people, and tell us that we needed to fit those on all of our patients that were presbyopic. The contact lens companies were pushing them. They had researchers that were actually added to the story. It was kind of a big conglomerate of 3 different groups that were pushing those lenses. And I was one and other people who tried to make sense of the situation. And it took 20 years to get to the point where we are today, where we really better understand what we should do in clinical practice with presbyopic correction. And I remember when silicone hydrogel lenses came out, they were going to solve the problem of extended wear. We had speakers out there that were claiming everybody should be fit for extended wear with these silicone hydrogels. There weren't going to be any microbial keratitis or acanthamoeba after we started fitting these lenses. You remember who they were. And there were researchers out there that were added to that saying, yeah, that's true. And the contact lens companies were pushing those lenses so we don't buy them and fit them extended wear. All turned to be false. So I'm naturally skeptical now. There's another thing currently. Look at the array of dry eye products and diagnostic techniques. You got clinicians, particularly one I like is tear lab. The little tear lab is supposed to measure tear osmolarity. That doesn't do anything like what it's supposed to do. But that was hyped beyond belief. A lot of people bought it and put it in their practice. You had researchers out there saying this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. You had clinicians saying they put them in their practice and they said, oh, I can't do a dry eye analysis without this tear lab thing. And you had the company out there hyping it like, getting it on the formulary so you can get paid for actually doing the technique. And then once it got out there, the clinicians find out that it's not really in their practice hardly at all. So I think particularly now in the dry eye area, we got, and it's actually been called the dry eye combine. Dwight Eisenhower had a comment many years ago on his farewell speech. He coined the word military industrial complex. And what we have is a group of clinicians, some of them. There are really great clinicians that look at the data, but you got people out there that hype every new thing beyond belief. And they have some connections with companies. And then you have some researchers that hype things beyond belief because they want to get research. And you have the companies. And then you put the government trying to get them on formularies so they can get clinicians paid for them. And it's a huge clinical, academic, industrial complex. So I want you to listen to speakers in this area and try to evaluate the material. And a lot of them are really good researchers. I think you've got some at Ohio State that are really good. These guys over here are never going to do this. But they're not going to, watch them overhyping. I've seen it overhyped before, and I don't want it to be overhyped again. So I want you to be aware of the clinical, academic, and industrial complex. So now you have an Oxyopia about the future of contact lenses, both in the area of hyperpermeability and especially in the area of hyperosmolarity. And if we could cure the hyperosmolarity issue, we might be able to have an innocuous contact lens that doesn't have any irritation hardly at all. And in fact, you could envision a contact lens if you could solve the osmolarity issue that would maybe be hyper comfortable. They would make the eye feel more comfortable than what it would feel like without the contact lens. So it's like when you put an eye drop on or you put a contact lens in, when you first put it in, it's all nice. What if a contact lens could do that all the time? So that's what, those are real, if we can attack the hyperosmolarity issue, I think that would potentially occur. And lastly, Oxyopia about don't discount the risks and potential risks of myopia control with contact lenses. So I want to thank you very much about having me in. And I enjoyed giving this lecture. What I do, I went about 12 minutes over. Okay. Everybody's still here. I'm glad that I didn't put you to sleep too much. And I really, really want to say that I enjoyed coming back to Ohio State and giving this lecture. Thank you very much.